Virgin Mountain Man won 10 labor girls, but he had shocking plans. The crowd jeered in the dusty rail town as a shy mountain man stepped forward at the auction. 10 broken women were put on the block, and to everyone's shock, he bought them all. The saloon roared with laughter. The Virgin Mountain Man finally got his harem. But then, his voice cut through the noise. He didn't buy them to own them. He meant to set them free. The town fell silent. A church bell tolled. Hooves thundered in the distance, and whispers spread like wildfire. What was this strange man really planning? Because powerful men didn't want freedom. They wanted profit. Contracts, guns, and secrets stood ready to tear his dream apart. One of the women carried a truth so dangerous it could bring the railroad to its knees. Now, a valley will burn, a town will be divided, and 10 souls will have to choose between fear and hope. Will this mountain man's shocking plan save them all or destroy everything? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty square as the crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. The 10 women huddled together, their worn dresses and weary expressions telling stories of hard journeys and harder lives. Some were barely more than girls, their eyes downcast to avoid the leering gazes of the men gathering for the labor auction. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, cutting through the din of the railway town. What do I hear for this fine lot? Strong backs, capable hands. His words drew scattered laughter and crude remarks from the assembly. Brian Hawley stood at the edge of the crowd, his tall frame rigid with tension. Dust coated his worn boots, and his simple cotton shirt hung loose on his lean frame. Unlike the jeering men around him, his weathered face showed only quiet determination. "Look who's here!" someone shouted. The Virgin Mountain Man himself. The nickname drew howls of laughter. "Come closer, Brian." Another voice called. "Ain't you lonely up in them hills?" Rough hands pushed him forward, and Brian stumbled slightly before catching himself. The auctioneer's eyes glinted with malicious humor as he spotted him. "Well, well, our holy hermit joins us. Care to make a bid, Mountain Man?" Brian's throat worked as he swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "I do." The crowd fell silent for a moment before erupting in fresh laughter. The Irish widow among the women lifted her chin, eyes sharp with suspicion, as Brian stepped forward. "All of them," Brian said, his voice stronger now. "I'll take all 10. The auctioneer's smile faltered slightly. "All 10? That's quite an appetite for a man of your reputation." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Brian named his price, and the square grew quiet again as the men realized he was serious. The amount was fair, more than fair, and the auctioneer couldn't refuse without looking foolish. "Sold." The auctioneer declared with a flourish. "To our virtuous mountain man. Seems even the purest soul can be tempted." He winked at the crowd, drawing more crude chuckles. Brian stepped forward, his boots scuffing in the dirt. The women drew back slightly, fear and resignation in their faces. The Irish widow's eyes blazed with defiance, expecting the worst despite his reputation. "These women," Brian announced, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet, "are free." He paused, gathering strength. "I'll pay them fair wages for honest work. They're not property. They're hired hands, same as any man." The auctioneer's face darkened with rage. "Now see here," he began, but Brian continued speaking, his quiet voice somehow cutting through the bigger man's bluster. "They'll have proper contracts. Fair pay. The choice to stay or leave as they please." His hands were steady as he pulled out a leather pouch, counting out the promised payment. The crowd's mood shifted dangerously. Some men still laughed, but others muttered angrily. The auctioneer's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "You can't do this," he snarled. "This ain't how things work here. You're making a mockery of—" "It's done," Brian said simply, holding out the money. "Legal and proper. Unless you're saying your word at auction isn't binding?" The auctioneer snatched the payment, his fingers crushing the bills. "Get out," he spat. "Take your hired hands and get out of my sight." Brian turned to the women, his manner gentle despite the tension thrumming through the air. "If you'll follow me, ladies. I've got wagons at the livery stable." The Irish widow was the first to move, her chin still high as she stepped forward. The others followed, some still fearful, others showing the first glimmers of hope. The crowd parted unwillingly as Brian led the women toward the stable, their boots raising little puffs of dust in the late afternoon light. Angry mutters followed them, punctuated by crude jokes and dark laughter. Virgin Mountain Man with his own harem. Reckon he'll learn some new prayers tonight. Bet those girls teach him a thing or two. Brian kept his eyes forward, his back straight, though a flush crept up his neck at the crude implications. The women stayed close together as they walked, the Irish widow bringing up the rear with a fierce glare for anyone who stepped too near. The livery stable shadow offered brief shelter from both sun and stares as Brian led them inside. The familiar sense of hay and leather filled the air, and somewhere in the darkness, a horse stomped restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. The evening sun sank behind Silver Bluff's weathered buildings as Brian led the women toward a sturdy wagon he'd arranged to rent. The livery stable's musty interior offered welcome shelter from the townspeople's lingering stares. Lantern light cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as the women settled onto fresh hay bales, their exhaustion evident in slumped shoulders and weary sighs. "Rest here," Brian said softly, his voice gentle but awkward. "I need to fetch supplies before the general store closes." The Irish widow's green eyes narrowed. "And leave us locked up like cattle?" "No, ma'am," Brian replied, fidgeting with his hat brim. "The stable doors stay unlatched. You're free to go as you please, though I hope you'll wait for me to return." He pulled his coin purse from his vest, the leather worn thin from years of use. The weight felt light after paying the auction price, but he counted what remained. Just enough for basic provisions, if he was careful. The general store's bell jangled as Brian entered. Mr. Patterson, the shopkeeper, watched with poorly hidden curiosity as Brian selected basic supplies. 10 wool blankets, stacked high in his arms. Heavy sacks of flour and beans. Salt pork, coffee, and other necessities. The total nearly emptied his purse. "Quite a day you've had, Brian," Patterson remarked as he wrapped the purchases. "Town's fair buzzing about it." Brian merely nodded, gathering the supplies. The weight of the townspeople's judgment pressed heavy on his shoulders, but he kept his head high as he made his way back to the stable. The women had drawn closer together in his absence, whispering among themselves. Their conversation died as he entered, replaced by wary silence. Brian set down his purchases and began organizing them in the wagon bed. "Here," he said, passing out the blankets one by one. "The nights get cold up in the mountains." The Irish widow stepped forward, her chin lifted. Though she was a head shorter than Brian, her presence filled the stable. "What's your real aim here, Mountain Man?" Pretty words about freedom and wages. Is that just sugar coating on the same bitter pill? Brian stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. His voice remained quiet but carried clearly in the hushed stable. "Ma'am, God made you free. I didn't free you. I just refused to be part of keeping you captive. That's all there is to it." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception. Finally, she gave a slight nod and accepted a blanket from his hands as night settled over Silver Bluff. Sounds of revelry drifted from the saloon. Brian finished securing the supplies and pulled his bedroll from his saddle. "The stable's yours for the night," he said, heading for the door. "I'll sleep out here where I can keep watch." "Out in the open?" one of the younger girls asked, surprise clear in her voice. Brian nodded. Seems proper. He left them a lantern, its warm glow pushing back the darkness inside. Rest well. We'll start early tomorrow. He settled himself just outside the stable doors, his bedroll stretched across the packed earth. The night air carried hints of autumn's approach, along with fragments of angry voices from the saloon where the auctioneer held court. Making fools of us all, a slurred voice carried on the breeze. Can't let him get away with it. Ruining a good business, another voice added. Business, another voice added. Brian pulled his hat low over his eyes, but sleep was slow to come. He listened to the murmur of female voices inside the stable, gradually fade into silence as exhaustion claimed them one by one. The first hints of dawn were threading through the sky when Brian rose and began harnessing the team. The clinking of brass harness fittings roused the women. They emerged from the stable wrapped in their new blankets, regarding the wagon with mixed expressions of hope and uncertainty. Time to move on, Brian said, offering his hand to help them climb aboard. The Irish widow ignored his assistance, climbing up unassisted, but the gesture wasn't lost on the others. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled out of Silver Bluff, the team's hooves raising small dust clouds in the early morning light. The women huddled together under their blankets, stealing glances at Brian's straight back as he handled the reins. His mountain homestead lay ahead, but trust, like the sun, would take time to rise fully. Behind them, a lamp still burned in the saloon window, where the auctioneer's dark promises hung in the air like stale tobacco smoke. But for now, the only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves and the subtle creak of wagon wheels, carrying them toward an uncertain future. The wagon groaned as its wooden wheels rolled over the rutted dirt road. Steep mountains loomed ahead, their peaks cutting into the morning sky like jagged teeth. Brian walked beside the lead horse, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. He had chosen to walk to spare the team. The wagon was heavy with supplies and 10 passengers. Anyone wanting to stretch their legs can walk a spell, Brian called over his shoulder. Might do you good. 3 of the younger women climbed down carefully, their skirts catching on the rough wagon boards. They fell into step behind Brian, trying to match his steady pace. The Irish widow watched from her perch on the wagon seat, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When they reached a steep incline, Brian showed them how to wedge a rock behind the back wheel during rest stops, preventing the wagon from rolling backward. Like this, he demonstrated, selecting a stone the size of a dinner plate. Saves the horses some strain. Later, they came upon a clear creek tumbling down from the heights. Brian pulled up the team and helped the women refill their canteens, showing them how to look for the cleanest water where it ran fast over rocks. Cup your hands. Like so, he explained to a young girl no more than 16. Let any silt settle before you drink. His ears reddened when their fingers accidentally brushed, and he quickly stepped back, focusing on adjusting the horse's harness dot as the sun climbed high overhead. Brian called a halt in a shaded meadow. He built a small fire and set up an iron pot, measuring out beans and saltport. The women gathered fallen pine branches for fuel, working together with growing ease. The simple meal of beans filled empty stomachs, and for the first time, quiet laughter rippled through the group. One of the girls told a story about her childhood in Ireland, drawing smiles from her companions. Even Brian's mouth twitched upward, though he kept his distance, tending to the horses while they ate. When evening approached, Brian guided the wagon into a grove of towering pines. The air was cooler here, fragrant with resin. He helped the women down from the wagon one last time that day, then stepped back to give them space. I'll make 2 fires, he said, gathering wood. 1 here for you all, and 1 yonder for myself. He gestured to a spot about 50 paces away, well within sight but respectfully distant. After building both fires, Brian returned to the wagon and carefully lifted out an old cast iron kettle, its surface smooth from years of use. He carried it to the women's fire with gentle hands. "This was my mother's," he said softly, offering it to the Irish widow. "Thought you might like some tea before turning in. There's some dried mint in the supplies." The widow accepted the kettle, her expression thoughtful as she studied the worn handle. "Your mother's, you say?" Brian nodded, looking down at his boots. "She passed on 5 winters back. Would have wanted it used proper, not just gathering dust." He retreated to his own fire then, leaving the women to settle in for the night. They huddled close to the flames, sharing blankets and whispered conversations. The old kettle soon steamed with mint tea, its familiar comfort easing some of their uncertainty. The Irish widow passed cups of tea among the younger women, her movements maternal despite her hard words. "He seems decent enough," one girl whispered, glancing toward Brian's solitary fire. "Aye," the widow agreed, but her voice was stern. "Decent he may be, but don't get too comfortable. Decency don't stop bullets, and men will come for us. Mark my words. That auctioneer won't let 10 pieces of property walk away without a fight." The women fell silent, sobered by her warning. Across the clearing, Brian sat alone by his small fire, reading from a warm Bible by the flickering light. His shoulders were straight but weary after the long day's walk. Back in Silver Bluff, lights burned late in the auctioneer's office. He sat at his desk, sharing whiskey with the local boss as they drafted legal papers. Their plans to reclaim their lost property took shape in careful script, backed by both law and gun. But for now, in the peaceful pine grove, only the crackle of 2 fires broke the evening quiet. The women slowly relaxed, drawing comfort from each other's presence and the strange new feeling of being treated with respect. Brian's mother's kettle sat warm among them, a small symbol of trust freely given. After 3 days of steady travel, the wagon wheels creaked as they climbed the final rise. Brian halted the team at the crest, letting the horses catch their breath. Below them stretched a peaceful valley, cradled by pine-covered slopes. A log cabin stood in the center, its weathered timbers silvered by sun and rain. 2 old barns flanked the main house, their doors hanging slightly askew. A spring-fed pasture spread out behind the buildings, its grass waving green and lush in the afternoon breeze. Gasps rose from the wagon. Some women pressed their hands to their mouths in relief, while others frowned with uncertainty. The Irish widow leaned forward, studying the isolated homestead with sharp eyes. "It ain't much," Brian said softly, "but it's good land. The spring never runs dry, even in summer." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled down the gentle slope toward home. When they reached the yard, Brian helped each woman down from the wagon. His calloused hands were steady but careful, releasing them the moment their feet touched earth. He led them first to the main cabin, pushing open the heavy door. "This was my parents' home," he explained, stepping aside so they could enter. Inside, afternoon light filtered through clean windows, illuminating simple furnishings: a plank table, chairs, iron cook stove, and shelves lined with his mother's preserves. Tools hung neatly on the walls: his father's saw, planes, and augers. "Everything here is still sound," Brian said, running a hand along a shelf. "My pa built it all to last." Next, he showed them the barns, explaining how one could store grain and the other shelter livestock once they got some. But it was the empty bunkhouses that drew the most attention. 3 sturdy log frames standing in a row, waiting to be finished. "Logging crews stayed here years back," Brian explained. "Never completed the cabins when the timber played out. But the frames are solid. Just need roofing, doors, and some proper walls." He paused, looking at each woman in turn. "Thought each of you might want your own space once we finish them together." The women walked through the empty frames, touching the bare logs, imagining possibilities. Brian assigned each one a future cabin space, sketching out how they could be made snug before winter dawned as evening approached. Brian built a fire in the main cabin's cook stove. From their supplies, he produced dried venison and potatoes, setting about making a hearty stew. The women gathered around the plank table, some helping to peel potatoes while others found bowls and spoons in the cupboards. The cabin grew warm and fragrant with cooking. When Brian ladled out portions of the steaming stew, lamplight softened the tired lines in their faces. For the first time, the tension in their shoulders began to ease. Over the meal, Brian cleared his throat and spoke of his dream. "I mean to make this a proper cooperative ranch," he said, his quiet voice earnest. "Each of you will earn wages for your work. When we sell livestock or crops, everyone shares in the profits." He looked down at his bowl, then raised his eyes. "Most important is that each of you chooses your own future. Stay or go, marry or not. Those decisions belong to you alone." Silence filled the cabin after his words. The women exchanged glances, weighing his sincerity against their experiences with men's promises. The quiet stretched until one of the younger girls, barely more than 16, began to sing. Her clear voice lifted in a familiar hymn, one Brian's mother had often sung while working. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. How sweet the sound." Other voices joined hesitantly, the old words bringing comfort. Brian bowed his head, tears shining in his eyes as memories of his mother washed over him. When he looked up again, something had changed in the room. The women's faces held cautious hope, like early spring flowers testing the weather. That night, as the women settled into temporary beds in the main cabin, and Brian made his bed in one of the barns, hope took root in the valley. It was as fragile as a seedling, but like the spring that never ran dry, it offered promise of growth to come. The mountain air grew cool and sweet. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called softly. Inside the cabin, 10 women lay awake, each one turning over Brian's words in her mind, daring to imagine a future shaped by her own hands. Dawn painted the valley in soft gold as Brian gathered everyone near the main cabin. Morning dew sparkled on the grass, and the sound of songbirds filled the air. He had sketched out a rough plan in the dirt with a stick, showing where each new cabin would stand. "First thing is getting good foundations laid," Brian explained, pointing to the rocky slope nearby. "Those stones there will keep the cabins dry when rains come." He divided them into groups, showing each what needed doing. 4 women began gathering stones, selecting flat pieces that would stack well. 3 others took wooden buckets to the spring, establishing a water line for drinking and cooking. Brian led 2 more, Sarah and Mary, to the small goat pen behind the barn. "These nannies need milking twice daily," he said, demonstrating with gentle hands how to coax milk from the teats. Sarah proved a quick study, while Mary giggled when the goat turned to sniff her apron dot near the edge of the clearing. Brian positioned his father's old crosscut saw against a fallen pine. "Cutting straight takes practice," he said, showing them how to guide the saw without binding. Each woman took turns trying, their faces reddening with effort. When one young girl cut her first straight slice, her proud smile lit up the morning. Laughter burst out when the Irish widow, Kate, pulled too hard and tumbled backward into a patch of grass. She sat up, spitting out leaves but grinning. "Well now, that's one way to meet the earth," she said, brushing off her skirts. The morning wore on, filled with the rhythm of work. Stones clunked into growing piles. Water sloshed from buckets into barrels. The saw rasped through wood, each cut smoother than the last dot near midday. Hoofbeats echoed from the trail. Everyone froze, fear flickering across faces. Brian straightened, shading his eyes, then relaxed. "It's Era," he called out. "She's a friend." A woman rode into view on a sturdy pony, her dark hair streaked with silver. She carried saddlebags bulging with supplies, and bundles of dried herbs hung from her saddle. Era's wise eyes took in the scene as she dismounted. "I heard in town you had need of a woman's help," she said to Brian. Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the lilt of her Cherokee heritage. Brian nodded, grateful. These ladies could use your healing knowledge. If you are willing. Era moved among the women, her presence calm and steady. She noted the bruises some tried to hide, the way others held themselves to ease old hurts. From her saddlebags came salves and teas, each offered with quiet explanations of their use. The women gathered around her as she worked, drawn by her strength and understanding. When she cleaned and bandaged a festering cut on one girl's arm, her touch was both skilled and tender. "This will heal clean now," she assured the girl. "You are stronger than you know." As afternoon shadows lengthened, everyone gathered in the main cabin. Brian lit the lamps and carefully opened his family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He began to read, his finger tracing each line, sometimes pausing at longer words. One of the women, Elizabeth, who had been a teacher before debt forced her into labor contracts, listened with gentle attention. When Brian stumbled over righteousness, she softly offered the correct pronunciation. Brian looked up, ears reddening. "Never had much schooling," he admitted. "Parents taught me some, but reading don't come easy." "I can help you learn better," Elizabeth offered. "If you'd like." Brian's smile was grateful. "Much obliged, ma'am." From her place near the fire, Era watched the scene unfold. She saw how the women's shoulders had begun to relax, how they leaned toward Brian's stumbling but earnest words. The cabin glowed with warmth and tentative trust. She also saw deeper truths. She recognized the strength in these women, bent but not broken by life's storms. She saw Brian's pure heart, somehow preserved despite the world's harshness. This place felt like holy ground, a sanctuary where healing might grow. The evening settled soft around them. Through the cabin's windows, stars began to peek out. Inside, lamplight gleamed on faces no longer quite so haunted. Brian's voice continued, reading ancient words of hope, while Elizabeth helped him sound out the harder parts. Era added herbs to the tea kettle, brewing a blend for peaceful sleep. She knew the value of such moments, how sharing food, work, and gentle words could stitch broken spirits back together. This day had woven new threads of trust between these scattered souls. The ranch rested and fragile. Peace as night descended, cradling its inhabitants in a pocket of grace. The mountain air grew crisp as autumn approached. Each morning brought new routines to the homestead. The steady thunk of axes echoed through the valley as women took turns splitting logs for the winter store. Brian worked beside them, showing how to check wood grain and swing with measured force. "Like this," he demonstrated, his axe finding the sweet spot that made logs split clean. "Let the weight do the work. No need to strain yourself." In the barn, Sarah and Mary mastered the art of milking. Their confident hands drew warm streams into tin buckets while the goats munched contentedly on hay. Other women repaired cabin walls, learning to mix mud and straw for chinking between logs. Brian never raised his voice or demanded. Instead, he taught with patience, praising good work and gently correcting mistakes. His quiet strength and humility touched something deep in the women's hearts. Evening meals gathered everyone around the main cabin's hearth. Steam rose from bowls of stew while cornbread browned in the Dutch oven. Elizabeth continued helping Brian with his reading, and soon others joined in, sharing stories from their varied pasts. One evening, Kate, the Irish widow, surprised everyone by calling out, "Pass the salt, Brother Brian." The word brother hung in the air like a blessing. After that, the women stopped using master or mister, embracing him as family instead. But peace in the valley could not stop trouble brewing beyond. In the county seat, the auctioneer slammed his fist on a clerk's desk, demanding action. "That mountain fool's undermining the whole labor system," he snarled, sliding a pouch of coins across the wooden surface. "I want papers served. He's violated auction law and property rights." The clerk counted the coins and nodded toward a marshal lounging nearby. The marshal pocketed his share, patting the warrant papers now tucked in his vest. Back at the ranch, Brian hitched the wagon for a supply run to town. "We need nails and seed," he explained to the women. "And we can trade what we've made." The women loaded their week's work: fresh butter wrapped in cloth, neat stacks of mended garments, and colorful quilted squares. Their hands had stayed busy during evening story times. The wagon rolled into Silver Bluff under curious stares. Brian helped the women down at the general store, maintaining his usual quiet dignity. Inside, they conducted their trades with calm purpose, ignoring the whispers that followed them. "Look at that. The Virgin Mountain Man brought his harem to town," sneered a lounging cowhand. Others snickered, but Brian kept his peace. The storekeeper's wife pressed close to her husband. "Ain't natural, them all living up there together," she muttered. Someone ought to do something. Through it all, Brian sheltered the women with his steady presence. He conducted business efficiently, trading their goods for needed supplies. His calm manner denied the gossips any fuel for their fire. The sun was lowering when they returned to the ranch. Era met them at the barn, her dark eyes troubled. She helped unload supplies while the women dispersed to their evening tasks. When only Brian remained, she spoke softly. "I heard talk in town this morning. The auctioneer's been to the county seat." Brian nodded, continuing to unhitch the team. "Reckon he would. The law often favors those with money to spread around," Era warned. "Your good heart may not be enough against their greed." Brian paused, looking out over the valley as dusk painted the sky in purple and gold. The women's voices drifted from the cabins. Someone was singing a hymn, others joining in harmony. His chest tightened with fierce protectiveness. "I ain't much for fighting," he said slowly. "But I reckon God didn't lead us this far to abandon us now. Era touched his arm gently. "You're a good man, Brian Hawley. These women see it, even if the world doesn't understand." He ducked his head, embarrassed by praise as always. "Just trying to do what's right." The evening settled around them as stars began to appear. Brian felt the weight of coming trouble on his shoulders, but chose to trust in Providence rather than his own limited strength. He had learned long ago in these mountains that some battles couldn't be won by force, only by holding fast to truth and letting God's justice prevail. The morning frost sparkled on fallen pine, needles as hoofbeats approached the homestead. Brian looked up from splitting wood, shading his eyes against the early sun. A rider in a dusty black coat drew his horse to a halt in the yard. "Brian Hawley?" The man's voice carried official weight. Brian set his axe down carefully. "That's me." The rider pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Court summons from Silver County. You're to appear before Judge Wilson in 3 days' time." He extended the document with a smirk. "Seems there's some question about your right to detain certain labor girls." Several women had gathered at the cabin doors, watching. Brian took the paper, his weathered fingers careful with the official seal. "Much obliged for the delivery," he said quietly. The rider tipped his hat with mock courtesy and wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust as he galloped away. Brian unfolded the summons, his lips moving as he struggled with the formal language. The women crowded closer, fear tightening their faces. "They mean to take us back," Kate whispered, her Irish lilt trembling. "Put us up for auction again." "No." Brian's voice was firm. "That ain't happening." Inside the main cabin, panic spread as the women gathered. Some wept, others spoke of fleeing into the mountains. Brian stood by the hearth, holding up his hands for quiet. "Listen now," he said. "I gave my word when I bought your freedom. I am to keep it. But the law," Sarah began. "The law ain't always right," Brian replied. "But we'll face it honest, with truth on our side." That evening, Brian knelt by the outdoor fire, his Bible open on a log beside him. His prayer rose clear in the crisp air. Lord, I ain't asking for myself, but for these souls in my care. Give me wisdom to protect them. Give me courage to stand firm. Ara emerged from the shadows, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. Prayer is good, brother, she said softly. But justice needs hands and feet as well as faith. Brian nodded slowly. Reckon you're right about that. Together, they sat by the fire, planning. Brian pulled out the crude ledger, where he'd recorded wages paid simple marks, showing work done and payments given. Era suggested proper contracts might help their case. Even rough ones would show your honest intent, she said. Better than nothing before the judge. By lamplight, Brian labored over the papers, his writing careful but basic. Each woman would have a proper agreement, stating fair wages and living conditions. Several of the women helped with the wording, making it clearer than Brian could manage alone. Morning brought fresh worry as they discussed who should go to town. The women all volunteered to testify, eager to defend their freedom. We can speak for ourselves, Mary insisted. Tell the judge how things really are here. Brian shook his head. Town stirred up something fierce. Ain't safe for all of you. After much discussion, they settled on 2 witnesses, Kate, whose sharp wit might sway the court, and Elizabeth, whose educated manner commanded respect. Brian didn't like risking any of them, but their determination won out. Era would stay behind to manage the homestead. These others need a steady hand, she said, and someone who knows healing in case of trouble. They packed supplies as the sun rose food for 3 days' travel. The contracts and ledger carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and extra blankets against the autumn chill. Brian checked his mother's old rifle, hoping its presence would discourage trouble on the trail. The whole homestead gathered to see them off. Women who'd arrived as frightened captives now stood tall, pressing small gifts into the travelers' hands, a loaf of fresh bread, a carved lucky charm, a carefully embroidered handkerchief. Brian mounted his horse, while Kate and Elizabeth settled into the wagon seat. The morning light caught the tears on many faces as final hugs were exchanged. God go with you, Era called as they started down the trail. Brian felt every hoofbeat like a hammer blow. The familiar path to town seemed longer, darker somehow. Each creak of the wagon wheels reminded him of chains they'd left behind, chains that now threatened to return. Kate's voice broke the heavy silence. We won't go back to bondage, Brian. Not while there's breath in us. No, he agreed softly. We won't. They rode on towards Silver Bluff, 3 small figures against the vast mountain landscape. Behind them, smoke rose peaceful from the homestead chimneys. Before them lay uncertainty and danger. But Brian held fast to his conviction. God had led them this far. He would see them through whatever trials lay ahead. The Silver Bluff courthouse buzzed with whispers as townspeople packed the wooden benches. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Brian stood at the defendant's table, his spine straight despite the weight of hostile stares. Kate and Elizabeth sat behind him, their faces set with quiet determination. The auctioneer lounged at the plaintiff's table, his fancy vest stretched tight across his belly. A smile played at the corners of his mouth as he whispered to his lawyer, a slick-looking fellow in an Eastern suit. Judge Wilson's gavel cracked against wood. Court is now in session. Brian watched the auctioneer's lyre rise, spinning tales about contract violation and property rights. The words made his stomach turn, but he kept his face calm. When his turn came, Brian stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I got here proof that these women ain't property. He lifted his crude ledger, its pages dog-eared and ink-smudged. Each one's got wages recorded. Fair pay for honest work. The judge peered down his nose at the simple bookkeeping. Brian laid out the contracts next, explaining how each woman had signed her mark, agreeing to labor freely given. These are hardly proper legal documents. the judge drawled, barely glancing at the papers. From his seat near the judge's bench, the local boss caught Wilson's eye. A slight nod passed between them, quick as a snake's tongue. Furthermore, the judge continued, these women were sold at public auction. The law is clear about, if it pleased the court. Kate stood suddenly, her Irish accent clear and strong. I'd like to speak. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge frowned but nodded curtly. Kate moved to the front, rolling up her sleeve. Angry scars circled her wrist, pale against her skin. These marks tell the truth of that auction system, Your Honor. Her voice trembled but didn't break. We were chained like animals, starved when we complained, beaten when we tried to rest. She held her scarred wrist higher. Is this your law? Is this justice? The courthouse fell silent. Even the usual whispers died. Brian saw several women in the gallery duck their heads, while some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The auctioneer's face had darkened to an ugly red. He half rose, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. This court requires further evidence before making its ruling. He shuffled papers on his desk. We will reconvene in 1 week's time. Court dismissed. The gavel fell with finality. People began filing out, their chatter building again. Brian gathered his papers, tucking them carefully into his jacket. A week? Elizabeth whispered. What does that mean? Means they're buying time, Brian answered softly. Come on. Let's get to the wagon. They had barely reached the courthouse steps when 4 men stepped out from the shadows of an alley. Brian recognized them as the boss's hired guns, their gun belts riding low. Quite a show in there. Mountain Man. The tallest one spat tobacco juice near Brian's boots. But them girls belong to us, court or no court. Don't matter what some judge says. Another fingered his pistol. The thing's got a way of working out right in the end. Brian kept his voice level. Step aside, friends. We're heading home. Better watch your back on that lonely trail. The first man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Accidents happen. Brian guided Kate and Elizabeth past the men, his body between them and the threats. They reached the wagon without incident, but he could feel eyes boring into his back as they drove away. They made camp that evening just outside town, close enough to hear the railroad. Brian chose a spot near the tracks, figuring the regular patrols might discourage trouble. A train whistle echoed through the darkness, long and mournful like a warning. Elizabeth stirred their small fire. What happens now, Brian? He checked his rifle before settling near the flames. We keep fighting. Law's one thing, but those men mean to settle this with bullets. They won't stop, Kate said quietly. Not till they break you. Or kill you. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. Brian watched sparks rise from their fire into the night sky. Maybe so, but neither will we. They sat in silence as the train rumbled past, its wheels clicking against the rails like 100 small hammers. Each click seemed to echo the threats they'd faced, the dangers still to come. But Brian's resolve had only grown stronger. The law might bend to money and influence, but he would not bend to violence. The wagon's wheels crunched on gravel as Brian guided the team into the homestead yard. Women emerged from the cabins, their faces tight with worry. Era stood on the main cabin's porch, her dark eyes reading their expressions before any words were spoken. The judge delayed his ruling, Brian announced, helping Kate and Elizabeth down. But that ain't the worst of it. Inside the cabin, gathered around the scarred pine table, Brian shared everything: the hostile courtroom, the boss's influence over the judge, and the hired gun's threats. Shadows from the afternoon sun stretched across worried faces. They mean to take us back, Mary whispered, her fingers twisting her apron. Chain us up again. Sarah, the youngest, began to cry softly. Maybe we should leave, scatter before they come. No, Era's voice cut through the fear like a knife through butter. She stood from her chair, her presence filling the small cabin. That is exactly what they want, to scatter you like leaves, make you weak and alone again. She moved to the hearth, stirring the cooking pot with deliberate movements. You are stronger together. Each day you work builds that strength. Steam rose as she lifted the lid. The cloth you weave, the vegetables you plant, the fences you mend, these are not just tasks. They are your declaration of independence. Brian watched the women's faces as Era spoke. Hope flickered in their eyes, pushing back against despair. She's right, he said softly. We keep working. We keep building. The next morning, Brian began construction on a workshop near the main cabin. The sound of his saw and hammer rang through the valley as women moved between their tasks. Some planted winter turnips and cabbage in the kitchen garden, while others repaired the gap-toothed fencing around the pasture dot in the shade of an oak tree. 3 women carded wool, their movements rhythmic and sure. The clean fibers would become thread, then cloth to sell in town. Their fingers moved steadily, despite the uncertainty hanging in the air. This workshop will be yours, Brian told them during the noon meal. A place to weave and sew, to make things that'll bring fair prices. He ducked his head, embarrassed by their grateful looks. Might even teach them townfolk that free women's work is worth more than slave labor. As evening approached, Sarah's brother Tom rode in from his scouting. His face was grim as he dismounted. Riders, he reported. 5 of them, camping in the hills west of here. Armed heavy, looking our way. The news cast a pall over supper. But after the dishes were cleared, Elizabeth took up her hymnal. Her voice rose clear and strong in the lamplight. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. One by one, other voices joined in. The harmony swelled, filling the cabin and spilling out into the darkening valley. Brian stood outside, letting the music wash over him. Tears dampened his beard as he listened to their courage made manifest in song. Lord, he prayed silently, give me strength to protect them. Even if it costs my life, Era's quiet footsteps approached. She laid a hand on his arm, as if reading his thoughts. Strength is not in killing, Brian, she said softly. It is in standing without yielding. Her eyes held ancient wisdom. They want you to fight like them, with bullets and blood. But your true power is in standing firm with love and justice. Brian nodded slowly, understanding. But before he could respond, a shout came from Tom at the western fence line. Fire! They fired the old logging cabin. Through the trees, orange flames licked the night sky. The abandoned cabin at the valley's edge had become a torch, its light casting twisted shadows through the forest. Smoke rose thick against the stars. The women gathered on the porch, their hymns forgotten. Brian's hand tightened on his rifle, but Era's words echoed in his mind. The enemy was announcing their presence, trying to provoke fear or rash action. Everyone inside, Brian ordered calmly. Bar the doors. Tom, help me organize the watch. As the women moved to comply, he saw determination replace fear in their faces. They had built something precious here, not just cabins and gardens, but trust and dignity. The raiders might burn buildings, but they couldn't burn away the bonds that had grown between these people. The old logging cabin collapsed in the distance, sending sparks swirling upward like angry fireflies. Through the window, Brian heard the women begin another hymn, softer now, but no less fierce. He checked his rifle and took up his post, ready to stand without yielding through the long night ahead. Moonlight cast long shadows across the valley as Brian organized the night watch. He positioned Tom at the western fence line, while he took the eastern ridge where he could see anyone approaching the main cabin. His old Winchester rifle felt heavy in his hands, a weight he had hoped never to carry in violence. Lord, he whispered, if there's any way to avoid bloodshed, inside the main cabin, the women refused to cower in fear. Sarah and Elizabeth sharpened wooden stakes by lamplight, their faces set with determination. Mary and Kate filled buckets with water, placing them strategically near doors and windows. The youngest children were gathered in the back room, comforted by soft hymns and stories. "We ain't going back to chains," Martha declared, testing the weight of a heavy cooking pot in her hands. "Not while we draw breath." Era moved quietly among them, laying out bandages and sorting her medicines. Her expert fingers crushed dried herbs into poultices, ready for whatever wounds might come. She caught Brian's eye as he checked the cabin's defenses. "The spirit is stronger than the gun," she reminded him. "Remember that when dawn comes." The night crept by, marked by owl calls and the occasional distant crack of a branch. Brian's shoulders ached from tension, but he never lowered his guard. Around him, the homestead waited like a living thing, holding its breath. First light painted the eastern sky in pale gold when hoofbeats echoed through the valley. 6 riders appeared, led by the boss's chief gunman. They reined up 50 yards from the main cabin, spreading out in an arc. "Hale!" The leader shouted, waving a sheaf of papers. "We got court orders here saying these women are contracted property. Stand aside or face the consequences." Brian stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "Those papers are forged, and you know it. These women are free citizens under God's law and man's. I suggest you ride away." Laughter rippled through the riders. "Still playing preacher, virgin man?" The leader spat. "Well, here's our sermon." The first shot cracked past Brian's head, splintering the cabin wall. Chaos erupted as the riders charged. Women screamed, horses reared, and more shots split the morning air. Brian fired back, trying to drive them off without killing, but they pressed closer. The barn erupted in flames as a burning torch arced through its open door. Smoke billowed into the sky as panicked livestock broke free, scattering into the woods. Brian ran toward the barn, desperate to save what he could, when something hard crashed against the back of his head. Stars exploded in his vision. He stumbled, feeling rough hands grabbing him. Through blurring sight, he saw 2 riders trying to force their way into the cabin. Then came screams, not of fear, but of rage. Mary appeared in the doorway, flinging a pot of boiling water. A rider howled, falling from his saddle. Elizabeth and Sarah launched a barrage of stones from the window, driving back another attacker. Martha swung a heavy fence post, catching a man in the ribs as he tried to break down the door. "Get him inside." Era's voice cut through the chaos. Strong hands dragged Brian across the yard as he fought to stay conscious. The women pulled him into the cabin while others continued defending the doorway. Through darkening vision, Brian saw his homestead burning. Riders were driving off what remained of their livestock, whooping in triumph. But the women stood their ground, protecting their home and each other with whatever weapons came to hand. "Stay with us, brother," Sarah whispered, pressing a cloth to his bleeding head. "Don't leave us now." The raiders finally withdrew, taking their wounded with them. Smoke from the smoldering barn filled the valley like morning fog. Inside the cabin, the women gathered around Brian's still form, kneeling in a circle of shared faith. "Our Father," Martha began, her voice trembling but strong. "We will not yield this ground you've given us. Not to men's greed, not to their violence. Amen," the others whispered, clasping hands around their fallen protector. Era worked swiftly, cleaning Brian's wound with herbal tinctures. His breathing was steady, but he remained unconscious, his face pale beneath his beard. Outside, the sun climbed higher over their wounded homestead, but the women's prayers never faltered. They had tasted freedom, built something true with their own hands. No amount of fire or fury could burn away that precious gift. As morning light filtered through the cabin windows, their prayers continued, clinging to hope with the same fierce determination that had driven them to defend their home. Brian drifted in darkness for 3 long days. Fragments of fever dreams mixed with memories, burning barns, women's screams, the crack of gunfire. Ara's cool hands pressed herbal compresses to his head, while gentle voices prayed nearby. Sometimes he heard singing, faint and far away, like angels calling through mist dot. When he finally opened his eyes, watery sunlight filtered through the cabin's smoke-stained windows. His head throbbed beneath careful bandaging, and every muscle ached as if he'd fallen down a mountain. Era sat beside him, grinding herbs with her stone mortar. "Welcome back, brother," she said softly. "You gave us quite a fright." Brian tried to sit up, but dizziness forced him back down. "The women, are they?" "Safe," Era assured him. "And busy as beavers rebuilding what those raiders destroyed." Sounds filtered in from outside. Axes chopping, water being drawn from the well, voices calling back and forth as women worked. Brian's heart sank as he remembered the burning barn, the stolen livestock, the violence he'd failed to prevent. "I let them all down," he whispered, tears wetting his beard. "Everything we built." Ara's hand gripped his shoulder firmly. "Look outside before you judge yourself so harshly." With her help, Brian managed to stand and shuffle to the window. The sight stopped his breath. Women moved purposefully across the yard, carrying salvaged timber and fresh-cut poles. Others tended the vegetable gardens, which had somehow survived the raid. Near the spring, 2 girls scrubbed soot from rescued tools. The homestead was wounded, but far from defeated. "They won't quit," Era said. "And neither should you." As Brian watched, young Katie began to sing while hanging wash on a makeshift line. The hymn's familiar notes pierced his heart. Amazing Grace, his mother's favorite. Other voices joined in, the melody rising clear and strong over the charred landscape. Brian sank into a chair, weeping openly now. "I thought my strength would be enough to protect them. But I was wrong." "Perhaps," Era said, mixing a healing tea. "That's exactly what the Lord wanted you to learn. Look how His strength shines through their courage, even in our weakness." The hymn continued floating through the cabin, and with it came a clarity Brian hadn't felt before. "We've been fighting the wrong way," he said slowly. "Hiding up here, hoping they'd leave us be. But evil thrives in shadows." He straightened, wincing at the pain but feeling purpose return. "We need to expose what the boss and his men have been doing. Not just here, in all the towns where they buy and sell people like cattle. There must be others who'll testify if we give them the chance." Ara's dark eyes studied him carefully. "That path leads straight into danger. The boss has friends in every settlement from here to the railroad. Then we'll find his enemies too. Other victims. Other witnesses." Brian's voice grew stronger. "The truth needs speaking, no matter the cost." That evening, Brian shared his plan with the women. They gathered in the half-repaired cabin, faces serious in the lamplight as he described riding to nearby towns, gathering testimonies from others who'd suffered under the labor trade. "It's not just about us anymore," he explained. "It's about everyone they've hurt. Everyone they will hurt if we stay silent." Martha, the Irish widow, spoke first. "You'll need protection on such a journey, and better clothes than those." She gestured to his burned and bloodied coat. The women exchanged glances. Sarah stood up. "We've been weaving cloth, saving it for winter. But I reckon a new coat for you matters more right now." Others nodded. Soon they were measuring Brian with string, discussing designs. Their fingers moved swiftly with needles and thread, transforming rough homespun into something fine. They worked through the evening, sharing stories of others they'd known in bondage, people who might speak out if given the chance. Brian watched them sew, humbled by their dedication. The coat took shape under their hands, each stitch a testament to their shared struggle. When Martha finally held it up, the simple garment seemed to glow with purpose. "It ain't fancy," she said, helping him try it on. "But it's honest work, freely given." May it remind you what we're fighting for. The coat fit perfectly, warm and strong like the hands that made it. Brian touched the careful stitching, feeling the weight of their trust settle on his shoulders. I won't fail you this time, he promised. Quietly. You never did, Sarah answered. Now rest. Tomorrow we start planning your route. That night, lying in his sickbed, Brian listened to the women singing evening prayers. Their voices rose steady and true, no longer afraid to be heard. In his new coat, surrounded by their faith, he felt God's strength flowing not through his own power, but through their unshakable spirit. Tomorrow they would begin mapping his journey toward justice, but tonight their song filled the mending cabin with light. Autumn winds whipped across the valley as Brian led his small group toward the scattered settlements. Era rode beside him, her medicine bag secured to her saddle, while Sarah and Mary followed on their borrowed mounts. They carried blank papers, ink, and Brian's mother's old Bible for taking sworn statements. The first homestead they visited belonged to a widow who'd escaped the labor trade 3 years ago. Her hands trembled as she made her mark on the paper, describing how the boss had seized her farm after her husband's death, forcing her into bondage to pay imagined debts. "Ain't many dare speak against him," she whispered, glancing fearfully at her windows. "He's got eyes everywhere." Brian squeezed her weathered hand. "Your words might save others from the same fate." They rode on through golden valleys where aspens shivered in the wind. At each stop, Era's gentle presence helped ease fears, especially among the women. Her Cherokee medicine soothed old injuries, while her quiet strength encouraged truth-telling Dot in one mining camp. They found 3 men who'd been sold into dangerous tunnel work. Their lungs still rattled from coal dust as they described the auction block shame. "Write it all down," one insisted, coughing. "Someone needs to know what happens in them camps." Sarah's neat handwriting filled page after page. Sometimes tears smudged the ink as victims recalled their suffering. Mary proved especially gifted at drawing out stories, her own experience helping others trust her. By week's end, they had gathered over 20 sworn statements, each one exposing another thread in the boss's web of corruption. The journey home was tense. Brian kept watch for hired guns, knowing how dangerous their evidence had become. But God's grace saw them safely back to the homestead, where the other women rushed out to greet them despite the biting wind. "You're back," Katie called, helping unload their tired horses. The others crowded around, eager to hear what they'd found. Inside the main cabin, they carefully laid out the testimonies on the table. Martha brought hot coffee while they bound the papers with string, treating each page like precious gold. These simple sheets held power to shake the county's foundations. "We'll need to present these proper-like," Brian said, running his finger down one account. "Show the judge how deep this evil goes." A sharp knock at the door silenced everyone. Brian's hand moved to his rifle, but it was only a young boy from town, breathless from hard riding. "News, Mr. Holly," he panted. The railroad man himself just rode in. "He's at the boss's saloon, mad as a wet cat about something." Brian thanked the boy with a coin, then turned to find young Elizabeth, the quietest of his rescued women, white-faced and trembling. "He's come for me," she whispered. "My father." The room fell silent. Elizabeth's hands twisted in her apron as she continued. "That's why I was sold at auction. To hide his shame. He wouldn't want anyone knowing he had a child with my mother." Era moved to embrace the girl while Brian's mind raced. A railroad magnate's illegitimate daughter would indeed be a powerful, secret one worth silencing at any cost. "No wonder the boss is involved," Martha said. "Imagine the coins that secret's worth." Elizabeth began to weep. "I knew he might come. I hoped." Brian knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Elizabeth. You're not property to be hidden away. You're a child of God, same as any of us. I swear by heaven above, we won't let him harm you. The other women gathered close, forming a circle of protection around Elizabeth. Sarah's voice rose first, singing the old hymn that had become their anthem. One by one, others joined in, their harmony defying the wind that howled outside like a hungry wolf dot as darkness fell. They kept vigil with prayer and song. Elizabeth gradually relaxed in their midst, though fear still shadowed her eyes. Brian watched the women's unwavering support, marveling again at their strength. Together, they had gathered evidence that could break the labor trade's power. Now they had stumbled upon an even greater weapon, a secret that could force even the mighty railroad man to face justice. Tomorrow they would ride into town for the final confrontation. But tonight, surrounded by candlelight and lifted voices, they placed their trust in higher hands. The testimonies lay carefully bound on the table, waiting to speak truth to power. Outside, winter winds rattled the shutters, but inside, hope burned warm and bright. The meeting hall creaked under the weight of countless boots as townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder. Lamplight caught the worry in Brian's eyes as he led his group through the crowd. The women walked tall despite their fear, with Ura's steady presence beside them like a shield dot at the front table. The boss spread out his contracts with a flourish. "These papers prove legal ownership," he declared, voice oily with confidence. "These girls are contracted labor, nothing more." Brian stepped forward, laying down their carefully bound testimonies. "And these prove your contracts were built on lies." His quiet voice carried through the hall. 20 sworn statements telling how you forced honest folk into bondage through fraud and threats. The crowd murmured as Sarah rose first, describing the day her family's farm was stolen through false debts. Then Mary spoke of the auction block shame, her voice growing stronger with each word. One by one, the women testified, their courage kindling like flames passing from candle to candle. Elizabeth stood last, trembling but determined. Instead of speaking, she began to sing the hymn that had first touched Brian's heart in the cabin. Her clear voice lifted to the rafters. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. Near the back, the railroad magnate's shoulders stiffened. His daughter's voice, so like her mother's, pierced his practiced indifference. Slowly, his proud head bowed under the weight of long-denied shame. The last note faded into silence. Preacher Johnson rose from his seat, Bible clutched tight. "Brothers and sisters," he declared, "we've forgotten God's truth. No man can rightfully own another. These papers speak of great evil done in our midst." The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own laughter at the auction. Faces that had jeered at Brian now looked away in shame. "I move we end this trade," called a voice from the crowd. Second, came another. Soon the hall rang with aye votes. The sheriff stepped forward, iron cuffs ready. "Boss, you're under arrest for fraud and false imprisonment." The auctioneer's smirk finally crumbled as he was led away. Through the crowd, the railroad man approached Elizabeth, tears tracking down his weathered face. "Daughter," he whispered, reaching for her hand. "Can you ever forgive me?" Elizabeth's fingers trembled as they met his. Years of pain passed between them in that touch, but grace began its healing work. Outside, the autumn evening had turned gentle. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies as townsfolk surrounded Brian and the women, offering handshakes and tearful apologies. Children scattered flower petals in their path, while above them stars shone down on justice finally done. Weeks had transformed the mountain valley. Where burned timbers once scarred the earth, new cabins stood proud against the winter sky, their log walls golden in the afternoon light. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, carrying the scent of fresh-baked bread across the snow-dusted yard. Inside the workshop, the steady clack of looms filled the air as women worked side by side, their fingers dancing across threads that would become blankets and shawls. Through the window, Brian could see children playing tag between the buildings, their laughter bright as sleigh bells. Little Sarah, once too frightened to speak, now led the games, her red hair streaming behind her like a banner of joy. The new chapel stood as testament to their shared labor, every beam and board raised by determined hands. Its simple cross caught the sun, throwing long shadows across the packed earth where they'd all knelt to pray during construction. Brian remembered how even the youngest had insisted on carrying stones for the foundation, declaring it their church, built by their family. Now he knelt alone in that sacred space, rough hands clasped in prayer. Sunlight streamed through windows the women had crafted themselves, casting rainbow patterns from the bits of colored glass they'd salvaged. His heart swelled with gratitude for how far they'd come from that dusty auction square. The door creaked softly as the women filed in for evening prayers. They no longer moved like frightened birds, but strode with the confidence of landowners, each one a full partner in the ranch's success. Mary, who'd once flinched at sudden movements, now kept the books with fierce precision. Elizabeth, the railroad man's daughter, taught reading to the younger ones. Each had found her place, her strength, her voice. Eris stood in the doorway, her dark eyes warm with pride. She'd seen this transformation from the beginning, from terror to trust, from bondage to belonging. The healing herbs in her medicine bag were needed less now. Hope had proved a powerful medicine of its own. As dusk painted the mountains purple, light blazed from every cabin window. The main house filled with the scent of venison stew and fresh bread as they gathered for supper. Bowls passed from hand to hand, accompanied by easy laughter and gentle teasing. Brian, still shy but no longer awkward, smiled as he broke bread with his chosen family. Sarah started the first hymn, her voice clear and strong. Others joined in, harmony rising to the rafters like a prayer. Brian looked around the table at these faces he'd come to love as kin, not as master to servants, but as brother to sisters. His mother's old Bible lay open nearby, its pages marked with pressed wildflowers from their valley. The shocking plan that had once drawn mockery now stood as living truth. Free women working their own land, sharing profits and purpose, bound together by choice rather than chains. In their faces shone the light of dignity restored, of faith rewarded, of family found in the most unexpected way. Outside, snow began to fall softly on their mountain home, while inside, lamplight and love held back the darkness. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.